So I think we're going to go ahead and start. Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to our first official Equity and Partnership Subcommittee. And I will officially call the meeting to order at 8:02. We'd like to start this morning by doing some introductions, and because we are a small committee, we will go ahead and invite our committee members and staff as well as community members to go ahead and introduce themselves. This morning, Julia Brim Edwards was called away to a work-related emergency, and so she will not be able to join us. But I know she will be here with us in spirit, and we will certainly check in and make sure that her insight and input is not lost. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicole Maher, and I am at your service as the committee chair. And I also, during my day job, serve as the president of Northwest Health Foundation. My fellow committee member here, Dr. Henry, if you could introduce yourself and we can go around the room.
Hi there, I'm Samuel Henry. My day job is on the faculty at Portland State University's Graduate School of Education, and my other connections are I'm on the OEIB and the Oregon State Board of Education.
I'm Doris McEwen. I am with the OEIB staff, and it's my pleasure to serve as staff liaison to the Equity and Partnerships Committee. So I'll be serving as support to Nicole Meyer, chair, and the rest of the committee.
I'm Elizabeth Cox-Brains. I'm the Director of Research and Communications for the Department of Community Colleges and Workforce Development. Just here as a guest.
I'm Ed Seelig, Strategic Initiatives Director for OEIB. I'm actually the staff for the Best Practices Subcommittee coming up, but just wanted to help out if you guys need anything in equity.
My name is Hillary Free, and I'm a certified educator and curriculum leader with the BC Ministry of Education in Canada. And I reside in Forest Grove, and I'm on a partnership committee there called Forest Grove Partnerships for Education. And I'm also the Oregon leader for the Acoustic Neuroma Association as a volunteer. So I'm here today just to listen in because I'm very interested in the partnerships. My husband is with Intel, and I'm working with a group of volunteers to try and help build partnerships to fill in the gaps in our school district.
My name is Joanna Blackburn. I'm a doctoral student at Portland State University with Dr. Henry. And I also am doing an internship currently with Oregon Advocacy Commissions related to OEIB. I'm looking forward to listening.
I'm Pat Burke. I'm on the faculty at Portland State in Education Leadership and Policy. I also represent the university on the Cradle to Career work being done in Multnomah County. We do the data work for all hands raised in the Cradle to Career framework. And as Joanna just said, we're also doing some work with the advocacy commissions, and in particular very interested in the help that we can provide this committee as you get started.
Good morning. I'm Alton Gatewood, the president of Cascade Campus, Portland Community College, where we enroll more than 24,000 students a year just on that campus. I'm not a member of the subcommittee, but I'm just here as an observer to learn and listen. I'm very interested in partnerships, and that's been a big part of my work at Portland Community College. So thank you for allowing me to sit at the main table.
As we grow and add staff and committee members, we don't know that we'll always have the luxury, but it would feel uncomfortable to have our guests sitting so far away, and it would force us to use the microphone, so it's better to be communal. So really quickly before we jump in, we're going to do a quick review of the agenda. We have this is sort of our kickoff meeting, so we have a very simple agenda with an opportunity to discuss the scope of our work. We need to spend some time adjusting our timeline. And then we will be privileged to be joined by Dr. Rudy Crew, as well as the governor, to help us begin our work together and make sure that we have clear perspective from all sides about what our charge is. And then we will receive a presentation from Ben Cannon on the Achievement Gap Funding Team Work Group, and then we will be welcoming some public testimony. Are there any additions or missing components that we might want to consider before we proceed today? I'm looking at my fellow committee. Great. Looks good to you?
Let's do it.
Okay. So we will move on to our next agenda item, which is really a discussion about our scope of work and our timeline. So I'm just going to take a moment and read our purpose, which is to provide guidance and expertise in the development of strategies to reach out-of-school youth and overcome challenges associated with race, ethnicity, poverty, and language. And our deliverable is recommendations and next steps pertaining to these areas. So this is an interesting charge, and I wanted to add a little bit of perspective because our charge is, of course, to focus on not only some of the significant disparities that we face as a state in a multitude of areas, but we have a specific charge to really have a conversation about out-of-school and disconnected youth. And the reason that I believe that this is such an important part of our charge is that as we move forward in our goal of 40-40-20, and as we look at the data, you will see that we have significant numbers of out-of-school youth. And it's very easy to sort of talk about I think it's a 68% graduation rate, but often who we don't talk about is the students who are just not there. And there's a lot of misperceptions about our graduation rate and when we lose young people. And we know there's some awareness about our high school dropout population, but we in Oregon actually have significant numbers of students that we lose in 7th and 8th grade. And when we look at the significant numbers of students who are not engaged in school or in the workforce, we have incredible overrepresentation of young people from communities of color, immigrant and refugee populations, and members of rural communities as well. And so while there are many issues of significant importance to us, just generally under the term of equity, and I know that we will get to that, we do have a very specific charge around disconnected and out-of-school youth. So I wanted to talk about that and reflect on that a little bit because that does add a little bit more of a specific focus. But I wanted to invite Doris or Sam or any of the other staff to add any perspective that they might have or insight about this purpose or charge.
No, I think you summarized it really well, and I'm really glad, and you and I have had conversations over the last couple of years that speak to the need to put a spotlight on out of school and the disconnected youth. A significant proportion of which are immigrant children of color and children from impoverished economically anyhow backgrounds. And I would just really underscore that, as well as the rural population, the rural youth. I would trouble with getting older. About 6 or 7 years ago, we being the Commission on Children and Families, held a series of community meetings around the state. And one of the meetings we held was in Baker City. And one of the ahas that came out of that meeting was that we had a significant problem in rural Oregon around kids who were runaway homeless. The manifestation in the eastern part of the state was couch surfing and other manifestations, as opposed to Multnomah County, where sleeping under the bridge was a major catchment center. I think we have an opportunity here to really shine a light on this and to begin to approach some really significant best practices, realizing that we have similar problems in both in our rural and our urban centers, as well as suburban as well, but those are particularly manifest in terms of those that are out of school. And that's not to say that school is one of the most significant foci of our work, but it is important to remember that we do have a population, and if we are going to get to 40-40-20, it's going to really mean that we have to change some of the practices that we have.
Doris, do you want to add any perspective? And then we'll put Mr. Cannon on the spot and see if he has any perspective to share.
Okay,
as well.
all right. The perspective that we're talking about then is the charge to the committee. And I think you stated it very well. The only thing I would say or add and just really kind of think about is the system as a whole has put our children at risk. You know, we often call our students at-risk students. And for years I've said, the students aren't at risk. The system has put them at risk. And as a result, we're looking at redesigning the system so that when we get to 2025, we will have reached the goal of 40-40-20. So the goal is out there, and it's a lofty goal, but it's a doable goal. It's reachable when all of us work together. And so the creation of an equity and partnerships committee is to make sure we don't lose sight of the equity pieces, which Nicole has already, Chair Meyer has already talked about. I'm still learning protocol, so help me with that. But she's already talked about that piece, and so it's just to reinforce. And then the partnerships is because we can't do this unless we all work together. There are many initiatives going on in Oregon at this point, and so we need to find out what are those initiatives, what's working, what needs to be eliminated, what needs to be ramped up, what needs to be looked at that we can spotlight and replicate throughout the state. So that's the short version. You don't want me to give a long version, right?
That's a great start. Mr. Cannon, would you like to add any perspective on our scope of work or purpose this morning?
Sure, Chair Marr. I'm also learning the protocol. Well, you'll hear from the governor later on in the morning, and then I'll spend some time talking about some work that I did with the help of a lot of other folks this summer. So I'll save most of my comments. I am struck just in thinking about this question at the partnership piece of this title, and I think I've been focused primarily in helping prepare the governor for today. I've been focused mostly on the equity piece, but the partnership is important, and I know important to him insofar as, just as Doris said, the work here is to build on the existing efforts and successes that are happening in a piecemeal or patchwork kind of way around the state around these issues. It's work that the state will enter in partnership with parts of our public education system and also community-based organizations that, particularly with respect to equity, are often having much more success and have not been as integrated into the state's work and the state's approach as it ought to be. And I know for the governor, it's important that the OEIB help identify ways that we can better leverage organizations around the state, some of them ones that are working in culturally specific ways to help raise up kids. It's important that we find ways to better leverage that work.
Okay, cool. So I'm thinking about this in there's sort of a really clear charge within our purpose around out of school and disconnected youth, and then there's sort of a whole lot of other things that we could be doing. So what might be valuable is if we could have a conversation that sort of crosswalks our timeline and then really narrow our focus on clearly partnership is one of the other target areas that we need to have a really clear conversation with some clear recommendations about the system and institutional barriers. Maybe another sort of topic, but I think we'll need to work to sort of significantly narrow what we mean and what type of recommendations we can actually make to impact that. And then, in my view, and I'm very open to feedback, really focusing on maybe 3 or 4 areas is a lot to chew on, considering we heard from Doris earlier that probably a February or March timeline is when we'll be looking to have fully vetted recommendations brought forward. If that kind of a February, March, that is a good assumption for the most part on fully recommend.
Now, Ben, that was my recommendation, because the December 11th timeline obviously is not working. So I'm thinking that February would give the committee enough time to be able to present to the OEIB and then prepare any recommendations that impact legislation in any way.
Yeah, so it will be challenging at this stage, and even with February, March recommendations, to impact legislation in a meaningful way in a session that will move quickly once it gets going in February. So I would encourage the committee not to think about its purpose as primarily to impact 2013 legislation. I can absolutely see a role in helping support or kind of shape or inform how we talk about, who we're connecting with, and potentially inform some of the shaping of 2013 legislative session. But I think if that becomes the committee's primary focus, the committee will be frustrated by the pace of the legislative session and its ability to sort of keep up with that.
Can I interrupt you and just ask if we did want to shape any type of legislation or have any language included that had a stronger emphasis and values around equity and outcomes for a marginalized student, what would that timeline need to look like, just so that we can fully consider that option?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think February, March is not too late from a technical standpoint to shape legislation. Legislation won't be passed outright until most of it May or even June. So I don't want to take that off your mind altogether. But the sort of rolling out of the presentation of the work to the legislature will be happening in February. And then the conversation becomes so sort of, it moves quickly. I alluded to that, and it's really owned by the legislature. We've thought a lot about the extent to which the OEIB itself can be effectively involved in a legislative process. I think the answer is, like other boards and commissions, it can't be very effectively involved. It can, however, inform how Rudy and his staff and the governor and his staff are, what the sorts of priorities and values and language that they're bringing as they work on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis with committee chairs and other legislators on the process. So I don't know, I wouldn't want to take it off your mind. I just would want to caveat it to say, given the time at which you're starting this work, this is probably not the place to think that the venue to think that you're going to be the venue to be primarily responsible for really developing and then leading a piece of legislation or initiatives forward for 2019.
So can I kind of add to that in maybe a different way? If we were to think about what are the framing questions of equity in partnerships, and not particularly equity, but equity as other committees are thinking about their work, or as we're looking through the information for legislators. If we were thinking about framing questions that we would send to them, that would be the committee's consensus, that might be a way for the committee to work without being frustrated by having an end product of recommendations.
Chair, I like that suggestion in particular. When I heard about the work from the best practice subgroup, I started thinking of lots of equity and partnership ideas that really drill down into that. And I know their focus is on best practice, But for much of this to be successful, as our colleagues have said, best practice in equity and partnerships has to be it's got to be part of the
First and foremost, yeah.
spotlight.
Yeah. So, okay, with that consideration, it sounds like we can still have impact and give feedback and ensure that all of our subcommittees and any OEIB recommendations going forward have the spirit of equity, and we still think that February and March around a good set of recommendations is the right kind of milestone. Does that sound? Okay. And this hope of having maybe 3 or 4 sort of buckets of work that we bring forward recommendations around, I just think within that timeline, we would probably have if we're not careful, we could have a very, very long report with many, many recommendations that may or may not be read. I'm quite familiar with many previous reports. And so I guess I'm thinking about, when I was reflecting on our opportunity here, I was sort of thinking about the multitude of reports that exist previously and why they have and have not been used. And so my thinking is that perhaps very clear, very specific, and a narrow focus would be more helpful to us. Is there any reaction or improvement of that train of thought that anyone can offer, or does that sound right considering our timeline?
I think that sounds right. To the extent it's helpful, let me just remind this committee, as I did a legislative committee yesterday, that's sort of the core purposes of the OEIB, which might help you think about your buckets. Really, when you read Senate Bill 909, it's about 2 things primarily. One is building out a system of P20 education, so there's no connection between the silos. And making recommendations for policy and for partnerships across P20. The other is about investment and effectively steering the state's investments in order to improve outcomes. So those are really sort of helpful. What was helpful to me to take a step back, the OEIB can and has at times sort of been anything and everything. And I think this group should not underestimate the potential impact of its own recommendation around something that's not in one of those 2 buckets. People watch the OEIB, they pay attention to if you all were to say, here's something that the state ought to be doing that's really important, and it wasn't in one of these 2, people would still pay attention. So you're not limited to these 2 subjects, but principally, under the law, this is about the P20 system, the OEIB's role in helping knit that together through recommendations to the governor, to the legislature, and then through achievement compacts that you have the power to shape and adopt under the law yourself. And then it is about recommendations for investments. And so, obviously, the OEIB has moved forward work in both categories today. You'll be spending time on the P20 piece. You've obviously spent time on the investment piece. So it's one way of helping sort of think about.
That's really helpful, and actually the thing that's exciting and helpful about that is it actually crosswalks and frames kind of the discussion and suggestion we were having earlier. So if we really looked at the P20 education connection, really framed that as a way to sort of address the systems and institutional pieces that you mentioned, Doris, and I think that could be really strong. Clearly the partnership piece, that fits exactly into this that Sam mentioned. I think if we have and then I think the investment piece is incredibly important. So often we bring forward lots and lots of recommendations about equity and we never tie it to budget, and I believe that budget and expenditures are your true measure of commitment to equity. And while we're already somewhat in the budget process, I think that that could be a very powerful focus for us. And then, of course, the last being this focus on how to specifically reach out-of-school youth in order to meet the 40-40-20 goal. So I don't want to run this like a dictatorship, but how does that sound to folks? Or do we feel comfortable at least organizing ourselves around those 4 areas?
Silence is deafening. I'll go for that. If we get all those done, that's a good start.
Will you read them again, Nicole?
Yes, but probably not in the same order. So the first is actually kind of a frame on the P20 education, like the whole system, and breaking down the silos with a real focus on, I'm just going to say, institutional racism and historical barriers to the populations mentioned in the purpose. A focus on partnerships with community-based organizations and other institutions. Investments, so how we're making investments and how we're measuring our equitable investments through the lens of budget. And then the fourth being a very specific focus on out-of-school and disconnected youth in order to reach the goal of 40-40-20. I think our challenge will be that those are broad areas and just about everything could probably fit under them, and so we will have to work to further narrow what we need and what we want to accomplish. So I think that is going to do a time check. So we have about 15 more minutes, and so I thought we could spend that 15 minutes doing a couple of things, which was discussing sort of, we know we're going to have a great presentation on the achievement gap funding, but it might be valuable to think about what other types of information we may need to really have a fully robust conversation about all of these. And I think maybe we could start by having a discussion about what additional information we might need to really formulate our strategies around out-of-school and disconnected youth, just to take that one first. And then Doris, I think one thing that would be valuable is at our next agenda to really give ourselves some good time to continue narrowing our 4 areas at our next meeting.
Okay.
And if we can have an outcome today of really deciding what additional information we might need, then we will also be able to have probably a more specific deep dive discussion about out-of-school youth at our next meeting. Does that feel okay to sort of go deep on one topic and then build the focus around the other 3 as we go? So when we think about out-of-school and disconnected youth, there are many partners outside of the education system, primarily workforce, our work investment systems, and I'm just trying to think about what are other systems that we may need to consider before we really jump in. Are there any other major systems besides workforce that have a big impact on this population? DHS?
I would say DHS especially, with their whole series, an array of both services and data. To me, it would be really helpful to make sure this is data driven in terms of what are we dealing with, why are youth out of school, what's the pattern in which youth become disconnected, and what happens after that. It's from just the little pieces I know, there are a whole series of both stages and steps and interventions that could possibly be mobilized that we should know about in terms of bringing the partnerships together. One of the things when we dissolved the Oregon Commission on Children and Families was that there's a youth commission, and it would be really helpful perhaps to have some crosswalk and feedback from that youth commission also really possibly from Aaron Kelly Seal and some of the folks at DHS that deal directly with some pieces there, and also some of our partners who work in the field and are presently very involved in not just programmatic pieces, but a look at what the landscape looks like, and also on the other side, what's percolating and what do we know in terms of some of the scope and depth of what's going on.
Right, so I think those are excellent suggestions, and I think one reality that we probably need to discuss is that when we talk about out of school and disconnected youth, this is also a population who faces what we call sort of compounding equity issues. And so when we look at systems that are built to support vulnerable students, you will actually see, for example, when you look at our youth employment programs, you will actually see that the very populations who are so incredibly overrepresented in dropout and disconnected youth are actually underrepresented in receiving workforce support, and actually are not even represented in services on the percentage that they make up of the population, let alone the percentage that they make up of disconnected youth. Another compounding issue is that when we look at TANF resources, they are, again, many communities of color are underrepresented. So, for example, the Native community is the most underrepresented ethnic group in receiving TANF resources while they live in the highest poverty, and are the most overrepresented in foster care alongside the African American community. And then when we look at services for homeless youth and housing support for vulnerable young people, students of color, if we look at our state services, are actually incredibly underserved. So it's not just an education issue when all of our safety net and resources meant to protect these vulnerable populations are sort of struggling to find and serve populations who are incredibly overrepresented. So I'm not sure who would be, I think that the best data available is actually in the Tri-County, but do folks have suggestions of other folks that could maybe speak to that? The Youth Commission, perhaps Julia from the Coalition might be able to help us think about that.
I certainly would recommend, just following on Sam's suggestion, that connecting with IRIS and the Development Commission, they have a very specific focus on this issue, and then DHS, Aaron Kelly Seal. Those would be places to start. I don't know what you'd find in terms of data, their ability to sort of speak to these issues statewide.
Yeah, it just seems like it will be quite challenging to try to address this purely from we certainly don't want to be in a position where we're blaming those systems, and we want to take full accountability for our own outcomes, but I think that a complementary discussion would be important to have. The other piece of information that seems like it would be very valuable is that when you look at the research about best practices about bringing students back to school and successful models, oftentimes most of the recommendations recommend kind of a partnership strategy and do not necessarily recommend using school workforce to do those types of activities, and yet when you look across our state, that's our most common practice. And so maybe a deeper conversation about that would be helpful, because a lot of the recommendations seem to go unnoticed, and the best practices seem to be unnoticed, and what we end up actually doing looks very different than the research might recommend. Would that be, I'm looking at you, Doris, to see if you have any suggestions about who might help us think through that.
Well, I'm learning the connectors in Oregon. However, I have some good places to start, and so I'll start with what Iris, Bell, and the Youth Development Committee might be doing, as well as looking at what some of the school districts are doing. Because when we talk about suspension data, the things that are keeping the students who are disconnected from being connected, part of that has to do with some systems issues that are happening in school districts. So we want to know what they're doing to mitigate that. And we know that there are various alternative programs that are going on. One of my many hats in my background was being an alternative high school, alternative education principal. So my head is spinning, the wheels are turning on who to make those connections with and what data needs you might have. So I'll try to brainstorm some of those and send those to you and see what you think.
Sure. I think a couple different pieces of expertise would be valuable. One, if we can, and we can brainstorm and think through this, but if we can bring forward any expertise around our middle school loss of students, that would be very helpful. I have some ideas, but I'm sure other committee members might, because in some of our rural communities and many of our tribal communities and Latino communities, we have significant loss of 7th and 8th graders. Yes. So that would be a key data point. I think probably Iris may be a great strength, but also Joanne Fuller and others who have experience with what is known as the Student Attendance Initiative, which was a program that won national acclaim for significantly increasing attendance, but was sort of defunded due to political issues, might be of value. I think the other data point that might be of value is oftentimes we have a perception that the alternative school system can absorb or is an option, and at the end of the day, when we look at our large counties, they, at best, if they filled every single slot, could only take about 10% of the student population, and those are in our counties who are best equipped, yes. Which still leaves about 20% of the students with no options. So I think some type of assessment of that actual capacity, because I think there may be some misperceptions out there about what the actual resources are for those students. And maybe just getting an understanding of the lay of the land.
And, I don't want to hang my hat on alternative education as a strategy. I want to say this is what's going on as a part of the lay of the land. If we're talking about a redesign of the system, we're talking about programs where we don't have to have alternatives to have kids outside of a setting. We're talking about an opportunity for various kinds of programs that meet students' needs along the way. So, I don't want to think about it in terms of what past alternative programs have looked like. Sure. And I want to really give us an opportunity to recreate, a system, a redesign.
Well, I think that maybe a assumption I'm operating off of is that we need many different options.
Exactly.
And oftentimes the perception is that an alternative school strategy is, will take care of any issue of this nature, and I don't think that is the assumption. However, we have some really promising, fantastic programs out there that don't have capacity, and then we have some other things that just aren't working. So I think if we can explore the whole landscape, that might be
absolutely
the best value.
We'll get that data for you.
And I'm sounding like a broken record, and I hear this in myself, but we have significant issues around rural for youth and lots of institutions, but particularly school dropout. And as you put your finger on middle school years and the first couple of years of high school, and I know we're trying to find ways to narrow and focus, but I don't want our narrowing and our focus to leave that out. And so I'll keep raising it.
Good. You and I both. Well, and I think, it's an urban luxury to talk about if alternatives are a good option, because many of our rural communities have no option. Probably greatly desire having an alternative or any type of option. Dr. Cruz?
One of the things that it is becoming more and more clear when you look at both dropout data and if you look at it over time, is that the flaw in the current structure, the current system of middle school, high school. So I will think of this conventionally as, say 6th through 12th. That structure is a flawed structure. It is badly flawed. It produces such variation that you have about a 60% okay rate and about a 40% exiting rate, right? That defines it as a flawed structure. And so for me, part of the dilemma, if we dare say it, is the current comprehensive high school as it is currently structured. And we've got to delve into that. It's not, what we've been doing is layering conversations like, what should the science curriculum be? What should the civics curriculum be? What would, graduation requirements be like, and so on and so forth. Those are okay conversations, but they are inadequate on a scaffolding or a structure that is badly flawed, as this one is. Anything that produces a 60-40 split in terms of outcome is a bad system. And I think it's, I don't know whether or not how much we want to walk down that road, but to the extent that I can, it would be my intention to start looking at what are the alternatives within the comprehensive high school? What are the alternatives within a comprehensive middle school that allow for students to get the relationship that they need, to experience high level and rigorous curriculum, to catch up needed coursework and or skill development that is at this point holding them back, gives them a chance to select or choose an interest based upon what they think, at least in the 6th or 7th grade, what they think might be their career orientation or their collegiate orientation. I mean, it's just we don't have any of those choices. This is a one best system, and it assumes that just people are going to come through and it's okay fundamentally if 60% of them basically say this works for me and 40% say it does not. But those numbers are never going to change if we don't fix that.
So I think a deeper conversation, so what we're kind of talking about now is what are the pieces of data or information that we really need to have a deep dive on that disconnected and out of school youth. So I don't know if you, we'll just invite you back to talk more about that, or if you have ideas, that would be really helpful, because, and I'll just frame kind of our 4 focus areas, and I'll probably repeat it again when the governor gets here. Oh, no, you're fine. But the sort of main pieces that we're talking about are, one, sort of the P20 education, breaking down the silos through a framework of institutional racism. Really having a focus on partnerships and partnerships with community-based organizations and many other institutions. Investments and how we're investing in changing outcomes with an equity lens through budget. And then, of course, the one that we're visiting about now, which is a real focus on strategies related to out-of-school youth and disconnected youth. And so we're kind of just thinking through what are all of the different pieces of information we need to have a really good conversation about that. And something you said really struck me, which is really when we think about our main high schools and our main middle schools, and we actually think about the amount of budget that is lost to districts because of such a significant loss of students, and we oftentimes are in a conversation in education about the loss of resources, but in the community I live in, we have significant high schools that forego millions and millions and millions of dollars because they're apparently comfortable not having those students there. And so I think that might be an interesting data point as well about our overall loss of resources for these middle schools and high schools who have a significant loss of students. But I think the piece that you're really hitting on is oftentimes we just think about a solution to get them back in the door, but fundamentally it doesn't matter how many times you bring students back into a door if they feel unwelcome, if it's not a comfortable place. It ultimately is probably just re-traumatizing the students.
I apologize, I just want to throw this out. Discipline data might be good for you guys to have.
Discipline data would be great. So we've actually gone over our time, and so I took a little time to frame where we're at, but we actually wanted to take advantage of you, Dr. Crew, and invite you to help us think about our charge. I've kind of shared where we've gotten thus far. Our thinking was to narrow our focus to maybe 4 areas that we could really focus on and come forward with some good recommendations. I shared what those 4 are. That some of them need more narrowing, to be frank. And we are changing our timeline to late February, early March deadline. We don't think we'll have our recommendations done by today, which is our goal. We are very highly functional committee, but we're not quite that functional. So if you would like to help us think about that charge, we'd love to invite you to share with us.
So there, in thinking about this, actually, we had Doris and I had somewhat of a conversation about this some time ago, and the question for me at a macro level is, what's the lens that we would systemically use, not just today, but that we would use perennially, that would offer us an opportunity to do essentially 3 things. One, create and sustain new opportunities for students based upon data. 2, enable us to intervene faster and with greater precision in areas where we see there are growing data points of evidence to suggest that we're losing students. C, that would give us a lens that would give us a sort of a opportunity to maximize investments. And 4, an opportunity for us to capture, or D rather, give us an opportunity to capture practice and disseminate practice so that it really gives us spread and a kind of a network of where are the go-to spots. So we're never without the capacity to have really good models that we can always go to. We're never without the capacity to have that. Some of that actually exists right now, but it's not on any kind of a sort of systemic shared drive. Right? It just exists, and somebody will say, "Oh, what about?" And you'll go visit it, and you think, "Wow, what a great model! You know, what a great program!" But who knew?
Right.
Right?
People next door don't know.
People next door don't know. Right. So that's a way of being able to kind of formulate that. One of the things that is really important to me, and I apologize if I didn't hear this because I didn't hear this earlier, but the notion of institutional racism, in my mind, offers us an opportunity to ask the question at a deeper level of what are the conditions that, if you flip this on its nose a little bit, what are the conditions that maximize student relationships in the P20 system, right? Like, so you might ask that about Native students. You might ask that about, and they might give you an answer, or that community could begin to. It might be a different answer from what it would be for African American students or Hispanic students or Russian students, right? But the conditions of our schools, the elements within them, the human texture, the curriculum of it, the cultural sort of realities of it, the time of it, etc. All of those things, in my mind, are conditions that we should be using our lens to fetter out and maximize way of being able to structure this conversation, so that when we're finished when we make recommendations, we are making recommendations off of the notion that we now know, you know, no matter who it is in the state, no matter where they are, for rural, suburban, etc., these are the conditions that continually come up as evidencing here is what it takes to keep this student tethered to the learning act.
reflect, and we haven't talked about this yet, and I think it probably fits within our bucket of P20 education connection, but I've heard this from community member after community member about really the achievement gap and some of the deepest disparities starting in early childhood, and the fact that while we recognize we're under-resourced for early childhood in general, when you actually look at who gets served, we have significant issues with communities of color and the poorest residents of Oregon continually not getting served within that system, because when there's a lack of resources, organizations struggle to serve, you know, who comes through the door. But in many communities across the state, we actually underserve African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans,
Right.
immigrants, poor rural folks, and it starts us with deep, deep disparities. And how would you recommend we think about that or add to that conversation? It seems like they might not be there yet in their discussions. How could we help them?
With early learning.
Early learning and some of the
Yeah.
early equity issues.
Actually, I would agree. I would agree with you about that. This is such a wonderful opportunity, time-wise, to enter into this conversation with them, because they're really pulling on one of the levers, right? So what I would do is to ask them to put our lens against their work. I would just simply say, take the lens that we're using here and apply it to your work, and offer us a deeper conversation, first of all, followed by then a deeper understanding of how their work is informed and/or it might change by virtue of the use of this lens. I mean, I almost think this is true around the entire state, to be perfectly honest with you. I always hesitate to even sort of go down this road, because it always sound like a naysayer, and I don't mean to, but I just think that we have talked about this issue for so long that it's actually comfortable to just talk about it. And I almost think that the objective is to talk about it. And so I think that you actually have to say, as a committee or as a recommendation potentially, and I'm not trying to scope this right now, but I'm saying it would be helpful if we actually offered the state anytime we are building systemic bodies of work in the P20, this by policy is the lens by which we have to actually look at this work. Whether it's budget work, whether it's...
So you're talking about a very concrete equity lens that must be used anytime we're making any
Anytime we're
expenditure or
talking
any
about this conversation, because we are limping into the demographic shifts of our state. We're not assuming leadership in that. We're limping into it. And I'm thinking, what would it take to actually get us to be more upright in that conversation? Well, data would clearly be a big portion of that. But secondly, a lens, a way of being able to facilitate very hard conversations about the data that then lead to the building of, or the intervention of, or the creation of new settings in which students, where we find them falling away from the bandwidth, are attended to, and that there just shouldn't be this way of looking at this that is sort of bipolar almost. It's like, what do you want to? How do you want to talk about the people that we don't ever talk about, kind of thing? I mean, it can't be the way that we think about this. So I think this has got to be baked into the system. It's got to be baked into the work, baked into the infrastructure of how we think about all of our P20 policies, all of our P20 objectives, and so forth. And not a committee, not committed to death, but rather just used, just harnessed.
So I almost hear a couple of things in addition to the equity lens. It almost sounds like we need kind of a really clear statement that really talks about the future of Oregon's success,
Yes.
depending on the success of all of our students, and a really clear value statement, and also being crystal clear that we want to break our pattern of a state of we love to talk about data and debate it and then not actually do anything about it. So we need to sort of break that pattern, and we also need to break our pattern of sort of like the Oregon Try Hard, like we did all these different activities, therefore we hope the problem gets better.
Right.
So it almost, I don't know
Yeah.
if that would go in an inspirational
Yes.
vision statement, but sort of something really
That's
clearly
right.
stating that's a new day, and then a very concrete equity lens, and then a series of very specific recommendations
Right.
in the 4 areas that we talked about.
Right.
Is that
Right, that would do it for me. I mean, I'm
over? We're here to serve you.
yeah, right.
So.
Famous last words.
That sounds really exciting.
There was one other thing I wanted to say about this that has been in my mind now. Is, you know, and Sam talks about it with respect to the rural communities. In some ways, the sort of narrowness of our thinking about some of the programs we devise makes us then think about other populations, whether they're poor populations or language different populations and so forth. It makes us think about those as almost, now, here's the norm, and then how do we do something abnormal to go get the abnormal, right? To refer to and structure a way, but so what I'm thinking might be helpful is that's why I keep going back to this thing of high school diplomas. I mean, 60% of the kids in this state basically, and this is pretty much true nationally, 60% of the kids in this state, for the most part, can go through any of our comprehensive high schools and do a relatively good job of graduating. But you've got a growing number of 40%, arguably higher when you look at certain subgroups, but arguably you've got a growing number of people who are looking at and going through that same system, and it is a complete opposite set of experiences. It's complete opposite. So if you unpack it, you ask yourself then, what are the systemic checks, right, that we actually should be paying attention to, like at the end of the year, or at I don't know if you do a state of the state or however this all works here, but at some point in time, we've got to put out in front of people that all really did mean all. All really did mean all by OEIB standards, right? And we've got to do a gut check on did we succeed with all, or where are we with all?
And this is just making me think of something. Our male, when we think about, we think about our 60-40, and for many communities, getting a 40% graduation rate would be an achievement.
Yeah.
But when we look at our male graduation rates compared to female, it's largely, like for Latino, African American, and Native males, it's in the 10 to 15% range.
Right.
And our females are actually in the 40-something, and that creates about a 36% average or whatever in many communities. And so we really need to include gender as an issue for our out-of-school youth, because interestingly enough, we still are very pro-girl-specific initiatives, but we're still in an age where we're funding many girl-specific initiatives, and actually it's our males that are doing much, much worse. As an example of a non-data-driven decision on our part. So that would be another piece. So is there anything we need to do before the governor gets here?
Could I'll tell you what would be helpful for me is to just hear, and again, maybe you've done this already, but I don't know, again, I keep thinking of the luxury of being in a P20 world is that you've got university communities that have been studying stuff like this for a very long time. And I don't know where the reservoir of brilliance is in the state, but I presume that there are lots of people who've been on this topic for a very long period of time, and we actually ought to have that.
Yeah.
We ought to know what those reports say. I don't know what they are, but it just seems to me that there ought to be, some validation of our inquiry here, some way of being able to say, hey, listen, this has been going for a while. And
there's some excellent resources, and there's actually many previous reports around this topic. and actually Mr. Burke, who's down at the end of the table typing away, has actually authored and assisted in many, many reports as well. So we actually have we have mountains of data that demonstrate the need for this kind of work, where we have oftentimes not moved, and I'll invite our guest, Pat, to chime in if you have any commentary you'd like to give, but where we've often fallen short is the action part. That's my opinion, but.
Could I just, as Pat gets going, most of you know Pat has a very distinguished present and history, and served as Deputy Superintendent of Schools. Pat has this wonderful, presentation in which he looks at what has happened over the last couple of decades in terms of some real equity issues. And as we are putting together, our data looks, I would really hope that, and Pat's not even making eye contact with me now, but I would really hope that could be a part of the presentations, and Pat's been gracious enough to do that for some of my colleagues and for our doctoral students at Portland State, and there's no reason it should be just confined there, but I would hope that Pat would have an opportunity to
That would be wonderful.
engage us with the data. And
Hi, welcome.
Sorry,
You're perfect. Pat, did you want to give us maybe a minute of commentary before we invite the governor to share with us?
I certainly don't want to preempt the governor. It's much more important to hear from the governor.
I don't think so.
To the question of data, yes, there is an abundance of data. Probably certainly agree with what Dr. Cruz said. We probably have studied it to death and have not really taken effective action based upon what we know. Most recently, one of the things that we've been looking at is the question of defining a pipeline. That we have tended to compartmentalize our data and focus. We have had 12 years now of a federal law that required us to define school outcomes within a very narrow range of parameters that has taken, in my opinion, our eye off the ball, with the ball being what is the system and what can the system produce. So we have defined system failure by a very narrow range of grade level descriptors that, in my opinion, has led us primarily to blame kids for the failure of schools. When in fact, when we look at the long-term pipeline indicators, it's not the kids, but the system itself that seems to be letting kids down. So we've been looking more recently in Oklahoma County at what point do we begin to see a trajectory that leads to post-secondary success, and at what point does that trajectory begin to fall off the radar? And just to reinforce what you have been saying, certainly looking at high school graduation rates is not the place to look. We are even beginning to question whether or not looking at 9th grade is the best place to look, primarily looking at exiting from 8th grade, and whether or not that population should be the focus. So that when you have the current data looking at 9th graders, now only in Multnomah County, not statewide, but 9th graders, that population on a trajectory to post-secondary completion, that number right now is less than 20%. So by reframing the question away from things like high school dropout rates and more toward how many kids are coming through the system prepared to complete post-secondary education, you get a different data picture. And that's the work that we're working on right now.
Great. We'll be calling on you to help us going forward. So I'm going to share with you a couple of minutes where we're at thus far, and then invite you to help us reflect on our scope and our work. This is our first meeting. We're very excited. And the topics that we're talking about are really trying to create a frame around equity as the best opportunity to ensure success for Oregon, and that maybe a frame that would really remind us that the best opportunity to impact is to really have a focus on some of our most vulnerable people. We've just got done talking with Dr. Crew about the opportunity to perhaps create an equity lens that we could use to look at all of the decisions that we make and the resources that we spend. And then for the purposes of this group, we would like to finish some of that work as well as create some recommendations in 4 topic areas, probably looking at the end of February and the beginning of March as a timeline. And those 4 areas are first, a focus on out of school and disconnected youth. Second, a focus on the P through 20 continuum with a specific lens around institutional racism, and really looking at some of the areas where we have some significant inequities. For example, we talked about the achievement gap really beginning in early childhood. The third would be a focus on partnerships, and really how do we maximize our partnerships with organizations that may have expertise and success in areas that we may not at the state level. And then the last one would really be a real focus on investment and really measuring our equitable investment through budget. And when we think about equity, we're not just talking communities of color, we're also talking immigrant and refugee populations, rural communities, and communities in poverty. So that's where we've got today. We still have more narrowing to do, but we would love to invite you to help us think more and add pieces that we maybe have forgotten. And I also invite anyone else to lead out, to add in anything I may have missed in my description of our work thus far.
Well, I think you certainly listed, I think, the key areas. I think the idea of actually intentionally developing an equity lens that we would have to look through when we make these policy and budget decisions would be a step in the right direction. The reason I wanted to be on this subcommittee is I just think this is really where the rubber meets the road. You know, there's no way we can achieve really any of the aspirational economic or educational objectives unless we deal with the question of equity. It's just as simple as that, and we all talk about it. And I think we all intend to do it, but somehow it doesn't get done and we don't move the dial. And I think we have to ask ourselves why that is. There are 3 areas that just come to my mind. Are one, the whole issue of the discipline gap, and whether we should be collecting discipline data and disaggregated by race and ask the hard questions. What does this mean? Why is this going on? The second one is we've had the Minority Teacher Act. It's a piece of paper. It says we should do something. We've never put the resources or the structure behind it to actually, ensure that we have the diversity of teachers who have the cultural experience and understanding to interact with an increasingly diverse population. That means having some pretty frank conversations, I think, with our teacher colleges. And third one is the use of sort of non-traditional community organizations. I mean, your organization, former organizations, I think is a great example, that are actually working out there. What are the tools outside of the box that are actually working out there? When we look at so I think that's one piece of it. I guess the other thing that I'm trying to raise is that these targeted investments that we have got to be protected. Even, whatever else happens in the budget, we've got to protect those investments, and not just protect them. We've got to figure out, Rudy and I were talking about this yesterday, if you're going to beef up resources for STEM, you may have the course, but you have kids who are just not capable of actually availing himself of that because the bridge on the front end hasn't been built. And so it's not enough to put those dollars in. You have to actually, again, go through that equity lens. What do you have to do to make sure that those kids actually make that connection? I would say the same is true of college readiness. It can't just be an aspiration. There has to be a strategy and resources to actually make that happen. And I guess the last quick comment I'll make is on the out of school and disconnected youth. We created the Youth Development Council, and actually I went and talked to them the other day, and to me, they're not we gave them $1 million for gang intervention and prevention, but it'd be a mistake for them to become part of the criminal justice system, because gangs are not a crime problem, they're a jobs problem, they're an opportunity problem, they're an education problem. And we have to have a group of people who's really focused on that group of kids. And again, you know, the kids who are likely to drop out between 6th grade and 10th grade. So you have all the pieces here, and I just want to be a part of it and help move the ball forward and then hopefully use the lens that we create for our policy decisions at the OEIB and our budgetary decisions.
Thank you so much. Dr. Crew or Dr. Henry, do you have anything you want to add that I may have left out? Or?
I think you're on top of it. Let's do something.
Okay. The other commentary that we discussed is really shifting our culture as a state to, while we want to be data-driven, we have a history of talking a lot about the data and debating the finer points and never actually getting to the work. And so this committee wants to break that cycle. And also a behavior that we want to change is this previous behavior of doing lots of activities and sort of checking the box, but actually not having a focus on outcome changes. And so I think that we're going to frame it all in a very strength-based way, but those are important cultural shifts that we would like to make and have this committee help with that.
Sure.
Do you have any additions?
No, you captured it. You're spot on it.
Good. Well, at this time we have the Honorable Mr. Ben Cannon on our agenda to help us think through our achievement gap funding team work group and the report and recommendations. And before you jump into that, if you'd like to give any insight you'd like to add to our conversation, we welcome your input as well.
No, I don't have anything to add on the general topic. I think you've nicely captured the discussion so far, and you're in exactly the right place in terms of the areas of work for this committee. I hope that what have people received this report. It's just handed out with materials. So I hope that this is helpful as a sort of background, a staging document for this committee. It was not developed specifically for this subcommittee, but it could be useful. I'll tell you what it was developed for. The governor, in the development of his recommended budget, appointed a 5-member funding team to prioritize investments within the education realm, and he did so for other program areas of state government. And then that funding team asked for advice around equity in particular, and so we appointed or invited a group of folks, and we probably invited 12 to 16, and we had kind of 8 to 10 participants who spent a couple of days over the summer really thinking about how you would invest intentionally to improve outcomes and to improve equity. And so it was with a specific focus to the development of the 13-15 budget. It was with a specific investment focus. But the conversation was broader than that. They really spent a considerable amount of time thinking not specifically about programmatic investment, but rather what are the kind of categories of work that the state would need to support in order for us to move the dial around equity. So the report, which I'll spend a few minutes going over, what you've received is divided into 2 sections. First, a summary of their work. It doesn't contain all of their thinking and recommendations, but I've attempted to categorize their core recommendations. And then the second part, and it follows it really starts on the 3rd page, is a reiteration of the OEIB's strategic investments and that are in the governor's budget, and we've attempted to show how those are connected with some of the recommendations that this achievement gap funding team made. So how is their work, how did that inform the funding team, the OEIB, and ultimately the governor in the development of this recommended budget? April here to my right participated in this work, and a number of other folks did as well, and we're happy to provide that list of people who are interested. So the main categories, the 5 main categories that this group identified as the focus for the work included from the top, number 1, teacher and leader quality, and the governor has spoken to this, others have as well. It is reflected in the budget, we'll get to that. But the major point being, look, we've got this increasingly diverse population in Oregon. We have a teacher workforce that's become slightly more diverse, but not even close to keeping up with the increasing diversity of Oregon's student population, and that is problematic, as is the fact that too few teachers are supported and trained in helping connect with the kind of cultural diversity that they have in their classrooms. So the recommendations here were creating higher expectations for all teachers to have high expectations for all students, teacher training on race, culture, and different learning styles, and then the diversity of the profession, getting more diverse teachers and other educational leaders. And a lot of the discussion, these were people involved, were people who were in education and came to the table with examples of places where this work is being done in their view effectively. The second category that we spent quite a bit of time in was around curriculum and pedagogy, just what is being taught, and the importance of having inclusive pedagogy and providing students with programs and curriculum that will result in a well-rounded education, promoting critical thinking skills. And so here you have a call out for dual language immersion. There's a lot of attention to the effectiveness of that for students for whom English is not a native language. Enrichment activities around middle school. I think they like you, have this, we're zeroing in on that time period is particularly important for students who are at risk. Arts programs and a notion that these students who we're trying to reach are, like all of our students, best served in an environment that provides the richness of opportunities, including arts and sciences, and then emphasis on developing critical thinking skills. The third category, and I think of all of these pieces, there may have been the very most time and attention spent came from this group, and the highest priority recommendation, although we didn't take that vote, but if I was to attempt to try to capture what I think there was the very most energy around, it was this category of parent and family involvement in the work, and that the governor's budget should, in their view, express our ways in which we're really engaging parents in the work here, and that included language support. Obviously, many of you students are in homes where English is not spoken, so open houses in multiple languages, interpreters available at parent-teacher meetings, correspondence in different language. Greater promoting, helping families to understand the opportunities and ways in which post-secondary experiences can be accessed, and building that from early grades. Promoting best practices for parents, and something Rudy's talked to. How can we support tools for parents that will enable them in their desire to be supportive of their children's educational, academic development, better communication between schools and parents, and then using technology to help parents access the schools. I guess one story that was told that was powerful for me came from an administrator in the Portland public school system who participated in this group. And as a principal, there were a few students a few teachers at his school who were not effective at serving the increasingly diverse population of the school. And he struggled under the contract rules and to work with those teachers, and ultimately, in his view, those teachers needed to be removed or moved. And he struggled in that and was unsuccessful over a period of years. And then, through some very intentional work with parents, he engaged parents of these were primarily Latino families. He engaged them in the work of the school. They got engaged and he set aside time and resource to support some Saturday workshops and kind of parent engagement that was specifically focused on Latino families. And those parents, once they became engaged, once they understood what some of the barriers were in the school, they put the kind of pressure on the school district that was required in order to really change the culture of the school through moving some of these teachers. And he said, look, I couldn't do that as a principal alone, but when the parents got active, and so his point was engage the parents, engage the parents, engage the parents. They're absolutely key, and it's that demand side from the parents that as much as anything will move the needle both in a systemic way and then very directly for their children. The last two categories that this group spent a lot of time thinking and talking about included connecting to post-secondary, the very intentional supports that we need to provide first generation, low income, minority students. They called out some of obviously there's existing work in the space, including federally funded TRIO programs, college awareness and tutoring, college advisors reaching into schools, support for underrepresented minorities, learning how to access services at institutions, visits to college campuses. Again, all of this, things that are happening and are positive, need to be scaled. There was a call out of the POSSE program where cohorts of students who receive intensive support before high school are going to college together and are in that with that peer-to-peer support, which evidence shows for first-generation college-going students in particular can have a very powerful effect, not only in helping them access college, but then stay in college. Because the kind of retention and persistence at graduation is key as well. And finally, sort of picking up on another thread in this conversation and something that the governor mentioned, the importance of community relations, community involvement in this work. Not that this achievement gap work group that developed these recommendations was quite clear that the sole focus of our effort and thinking here should not be the public school system itself. That it really is about a community of supports that will help to lift and serve these kids. And they had thoughts about how achievement compacts could create shared accountability between schools, the state, and community partners, and the role of community-based organizations and non-sort of traditional public education providers in this work. So we brought those recommendations forward then to the education funding team, which worked with Rudy around the initial thinking on the strategic investments that ultimately were vetted by the OEIB and endorsed by the OEIB and were funded in the governor's recommended budget. I know many of you are familiar with those. The remainder of this paper attempts to call out in the italicized pieces the ways in which each of those four strategic investments relate to and pick up on the equity threads that I've described coming from this work group. So that's here for you. I think these strategic investments are very much designed to take that equity lens and apply it to these small but critical investments for not just perpetuating the system but transforming it. And the first on developing a representative core of professional educators, obviously that call out of representative core, this is in part about recruitment and mentorship and retention of education professionals who are non-white, non-Hispanic, or this still has some old language here that was just a typo, so I apologize for that. But education professionals who are non-white or whose native language is not English. So it is partly a recruitment initiative, and then it is also about preparation, mentorship, and professional development supports for all educators to ensure that they're able to more successful at providing culturally relevant, effective instruction that helps motivate, engage, and support underserved students. In the second initiative, which is titled Connecting with the World of Work, here this initiative picks up on some of the curriculum and pedagogy examples or recommendations that the Achievement Gap work group made. One of the major pieces of emphasis in this second initiative is funding for STEM and the arts, or STEAM, targeted at underserved students, promoting critical thinking skills, enrichment activities, project-based work. Some of the types of school and out of school, formal and informal experiences that this funding team, this Achievement Gap work group thought were particularly important for these students. The third initiative, Oregon Reads, I think pulls together many of the threads in here. It's in Oregon Reads where you see particular emphasis on supports for parents and families through a statewide campaign that helps present tools for families to support their young children in particular in reading. You have expressed in this initiative the really intentional call out of community assets that are not just school-based. So you've got libraries, after-school providers, nonprofit organizations. You have the early learning community drawn very clearly into this, and other entities that would be empowered through this kind of seed money to provide expanded and individualized learning time for students focused on reading. The initiative is targeted at all children who are at risk of not reading at grade level in primary grades, but very clearly a focus will have to be on programs around literacy for ELL students. And I know Rudy has sort of really called out that aspect of this investment in particular. And I'm sure Rudy will have thoughts to add about this as well. And then the final strategic investment is around guidance and support for post-secondary aspirations. Again, this picks up very directly on the post-secondary connections category of the work group's recommendations. Here you have in the governor's budget $11.4 million to help build this culture of expectations and support for post-secondary education. And there's a call out of early college credit programs, dual credit, scholarship opportunities, increased counseling, guidance in middle and high school, other college success initiatives that will target underserved students as a way to help motivate and inspire them to move on to and succeed in post-secondary. So there remains, and I think it's implied, Nicole, when you're thinking about the potential role of this committee, there remains work to be done to fully realize these, even as proposals, much less implement them. And we've attempted, hopefully this document is a starting point for applying that equity lens you described to the strategic investments. And I think there's an opportunity for this committee to be involved in helping to further shape what these investments, which again are just as, the dollars here are minimal compared to the need and compared to our overall education budget, but how to shape these seed dollars in order to prove out the concept that through targeted investment in underserved kids, we can move the needle and produce great results and thereby make the case for greater investment in these types of activities.
This is really excellent work, and I really appreciate the focus areas. I have a couple questions. My first question is probably borderline a little bit micromanaging, but I will ask it anyways. So in the investment areas, there are some really excellent priorities. I think one concern I've heard time and time again from partners and communities of color and is this concern and lack of faith that the Department of Education has the capacity and the relationships and the ability to make, to even advertise, to contract out for these services, let alone make fair and equitable decisions, or even have the skill set to really assess and judge who are the partners who could really implement this work. And I know lots of wonderful changes and positive things are happening, but how would you respond, or what things are we doing to improve the Department of Education so that they even know how to partner with communities and rural communities and so on and so forth?
Well, let me say a couple of things, and Rudy may have something to add on this. But number one, there are the changes underway at the department, and Rob Saxton, the deputy superintendent, has been very closely involved in the development of these strategic investments and the thinking behind them, and I think I know he is committed to these approaches and their success. Number two is the fact that not while many of these dollars show up in the Department of Education's budget, and we assume that department staff, if the governor's budget was adopted as is, department staff would be the primary that leads on implementation. There remains within how we brought them forward, presented them in the budget, a very clear connection to the Chief Education Officer, the OEIB, and your work. So what that means precisely isn't clear, but we were the budget is extremely clear that these strategic investments are meant to be OEIB, P20, Chief Education Officer guided, even as the infrastructure for implementing them exists within agencies, not just Department of Ed, but our proposed Department of Post-Secondary using Community College and OSAC and some university system resources. So that's, I think, one of the pieces of work we have to do before this becomes law, before this becomes the actual budget, is to more clearly articulate what is the role of the Chief Education Officer and the board in helping to steer, if not all of these, at least major components of the investment.
I think your question is a really good one, and assuming we can get this money in the budget, which is, it's not much compared to $6 billion, but it's a big chunk, and I think we really only have one shot at this. If we can hold this in, we absolutely have to demonstrate that 2 years from now, when we come to the legislature, we've made a difference, because that's what's going to let us really make a major scale up of the investment. And to do that, we have to think really, I think, very intentionally about who's going to provide the services and who has the experience. And we don't want on-the-job training. There's people out there who know how to do it and have done it. And so I think that's a question that we should have right in front of ourselves as we design the implementation piece of how those dollars are applied. Chief Chair. I'm just a guy here that I just showed up.
Someday we're going to have conversations about the difference between New York City government and Oregon, because you're the governor. So I always kind of going toward whether or not you're okay with me talking. See, this is where I think this lens is really important. And I think it's in part, it's an accountability lens without us having to be chargy about it particularly, but it's a way of being able to call the question. Mm-hmm. So what you just did was you just called the question. Mm-hmm. Now you're nice about it, but the truth is, if the system does not have to come to play itself out in living color, right? If we don't have to say out loud, this is the process, this is the timeline, here are the point people, right? Then all the back channel, normal, natural history and histrionics will go on. Loud voices will get a little bit of money to shut up. Non-voices will be dismissed. And the problem will just simply roll on one year into the next or one biennium into the next. So what I think is for me, what the answer is that I should be bringing back to this committee what the rollout of those specific initiatives that the governor, as he was just talking about, has, hopefully will maintain in the budget. But I should be bringing to you a rollout of that. If this isn't, you're not micromanaging, you're asking a management question, right? If you were micromanaging, I'd tell you. But it's a legitimate, honest question to be answered, and I am more than happy to give you what essentially is a sort of a Gantt chart, if you will, of here's who, what, when, where, and how on how this money is going to go out. Yesterday I was at the legislature. They asked the same questions. They want the level of detail about how is this going to be spent and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's out of I have it in my head now. We've now begun to work on it. Whitney and I and other members of my team are in the process of laying out how this would ultimately get converted into a series of work groups. We had a meeting yesterday with the department and had this conversation about capacity. Most of their capacity is a function of federal money. So they actually are obligated to do what the feds tell them as opposed to what I or the governor or anybody else says. So this is really about building a capacity that does not exist right now. And we've got to lay that out for you in terms that might maybe make everybody a little uncomfortable, but so be it. So,
but having that roadmap of how we're going to actually do it is really important element in keeping the money in the budget too.
Yeah. Well, and if we can get it right with this effort, I think it's could be a gift to the way we do other things throughout the department and other departments, because I think we've all seen too many examples of a really excellent intent and an opportunity, and then it's sort of reprogrammed to fill a different gap versus the actual intent of what we're trying to achieve. So that's great. Yes.
I just want to also say, and it's nice to be working with Dr. Crew, because I can always step back and say ditto. I had just wrote down the 3 things that I would say in terms of response to your question, and I said, the first thing is that the lens is going to help. And Dr. Crew said that the monitoring is part of bringing people into the committee so that we can actually see, what's going on. And then the opportunity that we have as an OEIB staff and as an ODE staff to collaborate and work together, I think will really be valuable as we move the agenda of equity forward, because we can no longer allow people to talk, as we stated earlier in the meeting, about equity. It's a matter of what are the strategies, as Governor said, what are the strategies we're going to use to actually move this in Oregon. So I just wanted to add that.
So one more just question, and I want to invite Dr. Henry if he has any questions about this piece of work, which was, I was a little surprised to not see any information in here pertaining to special education and our huge numbers of overrepresentation of children of color and largely rural communities the overrepresentation. We have many districts who actually have to send checks back to the federal government because their overrepresentation issues around race are so significant. And we largely know that is a result from inequities in the early childhood system. So children who are not having equal opportunity to participate in that system are not having the same opportunities or assessments, and then are being inappropriately or diagnosed. And so that seems like a teacher training issue. Other states have done some phenomenal work around really making sure that their special education workforce really reflects populations of communities of color. We're not even there yet. Our early childhood piece seems to be important. So did that just get discussed and not raised to the level of priority, or is that embedded somewhere that I can't see?
Yeah.
Or?
So it's a great point, and if it was touched on, it was not dwelled on, and for that reason doesn't show up here. And I think it's an oversight, and I would certainly encourage this committee to look at this as a living document. It's now yours to make what you will of it and add and build on it.
Okay, great.
And the governor's going to have to leave.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I'm very excited about this, and I will try to come as often as I can and be very supportive, and you have my number.
Okay.
So-
Did you have any questions or comments you'd like to share?
I had a couple, and I do appreciate the work that's gone into this, and I'll say this publicly, the governor's supporting this. I'm not one that tends to rubber stamp my leadership in the political process, both the folks engaged in it and the processes we use. But it has been a significant issue and a significant effort, and through the governor's office and Ben and Rudy's, I had an opportunity to go to the National Governors Association meeting of their education folks in Boston. When was that, Mike? 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? I don't know, it's blurring. And to hear what some of the other states are doing and they're involved in, and to be both appropriately impressed and depressed by some of what is going on there, but also to have a sense of what the context is. And I'm happy to say I'm part of this group and happy to reflect on the pieces that we've made. I'm also happy to see the ODE and its shift in direction with new leadership. I've for a long time felt that they were particularly good at checking boxes and compliances and not doing technical assistance and best practice, and that is being altered in terms of things happening, and it might even be helpful for this group to share some of what Rob has put together in terms of strategic plan. That was something that I was very impressed with when I went to the National Governors Association. About 5 states have really laid out how they're going to do not just the assessment piece, which was the topic of the conversation, but how they do communication pieces. And so I'm seeing some real positives with respect to that. If you've ever been in the room with me before, you know that including developing real critical thinking skills is definitely one of the things at the top of my list, and part of that is coming out of post-secondary, but the extent to which we're able to do that and sync it with what we start doing early is to me a piece where our success is. The teacher leader equality we've reflected on. I'd like to just make a couple of suggestions on number 3 in terms of the report that we got. And okay, I'm going to sound like a professor, but that's what I do. And my daughter tells me that, so I guess anybody can. One of the things about Western European framing is to think of parents as the only stakeholders. And for most families of color, it is an extended family. And so I'm hoping that we can expand this language here because we have so many, my colloquium is grandmas and blue-haired aunties who, and I still have one blue-haired auntie left, who frame up family leadership and the connections with education in some significant kinds of ways, and I don't want to see that lost, where the extended family must be involved in terms of the whole educational process. I've talked with my colleague, Dr. Digwood, president of PCC Cascade, and he is also really involved in how that communication and how that interlocking set of relationships involve the extended family. So I would like to see that as providing language support for extended family and the community. One of my hopes, I hope it isn't a vague hope, but one of my hopes is that through the community compacts, we are having public conversations. The truth is I'm still waiting in the district that I live in for a public conversation around the Achievement Compact, but thanks to our chief here and some other folks in the community, we're nudging that along. One of the changes that's going to make this possible is for some school people to realize that there are other people in the community that are also involved in looking at what they do. And that's taken some change, and that includes us who do teacher education. I want to also add maybe an F to number 3, and that's home visits. And there are times when it's appropriate, times when it's not, but most of the time it has not been considered as one of the family initiative pieces there. And we're finding, as some of the research goes on, I've got a doctoral student who's actually in process of collecting data about it now. If we really want to support these family initiatives, we've got to make some community connections that we haven't thought of as a part of what we do. I'll comment later on the post-secondary connections, but also in the community compacts. I'm going to just reify that the shared public conversations about what we're aiming for and what we're going to do, to me, are the root piece. And yeah, I used to teach civics, so there's probably, something from that. But that's not just the conversation with the people we've been having conversations with, and we're back to our lens. It's conversations with people who do come from 3 generations of poverty. And I know Hilda and I have been talking about how we kind of do something, with respect to that in terms of working with Don Beagle and some other folks who are, Doris, and been rooted in changing the nature of the conversation. And so I'm real optimistic. I really like the work we've done with respect to setting out some initiatives here and putting some investment dollars. I agree with what both the governor and Dr. Cruz say, that that's just a bit to begin to start that conversation. But I'm hoping that we can have that conversation both with our legislators and with our communities in some ways that change the dynamic of these conversations and become much more effective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to move us into our public testimony segment. Do we have any community members who have signed up for public testimony?
No.
We do not. Okay, with that, we will adjourn our meeting at 9:50. Thank you.